Welcome everyone, thank you for being here. My name's Lou Stoppard, I'm a British writer and curator, and today we're here with Miu Miu to discuss Alba De Céspedes. De Céspedes was born in Rome in 1911, a reporter, best-selling novelist, journal editor, and anti-fascist activist. She's known for her writings on Italian life, particularly women's place within that Italian life. Domesticity, motherhood, aspiration, and identity. Today we'll be discussing her book, Quaderno Proibito, Forbidden Notebook, written serially between 1950 and 1951 for the illustrated magazine Incom, and later published as one in 1952. The story focuses on Valeria Cossetti, a mother and wife in 1950s Rome, who on the spur of the moment buys a black notebook and begins chronicling her inner life. That process of introspection has complex results. It simultaneously liberates her, but also throws her into crisis. I'm joined with an amazing panel of women to discuss the book with me, but before we dive into that debate and discussion, we're going to have a reading, a short reading from the book itself by Tina Kunakey.
I was wrong to buy this book, this notebook, very wrong. But it's too late now for regrets. The damage is done. I don't even know what impelled me to buy it. Pure chance. I never thought of keeping a diary, partly because a diary has to be secret, and I would have to be hidden from Michelle and the children. I don't like hiding things. Besides, there is so little space in our house. It would be impossible to manage. Here's how it happened. 2 weeks ago, it was a Sunday, I left the house rather early in the morning. I was going to buy cigarettes for Michele. I wanted him to find them on his night table when he woke up. He always sleeps in on Sunday. It was a beautiful day, warm, thought it was late autumn. I felt childish pleasure walking along the streets on the sunny side and seeing the trees still green and people happy as they always seem to be on holidays. So I decided to take a short stroll and go to the tobacco shop in the square. Along the way, I saw that a lot of people were stopping at the flower store, so I stopped too and bought a bunch of calendulas. You need flour on the table on a Sunday, the flower seller said to me. Men notice. I smiled, nodding, but the truth is, I wasn't thinking of Michele or of Ricardo when I was buying those flowers, even though Ricardo does seem to appreciate them. I bought them for myself, to hold what I walked. The tobacco shop was crowded. Waiting my turn with the cigarette money ready, I saw a stack of notebooks in the window. They were black, shiny, thick, the type I used in school, in which before even starting it, I would immediately write my name excitedly on the first page. Valeria. I would also like a notebook, I said, digging in my purse to find some more money. But when I looked up, I saw that the tobacconist has assumed a severe expression to tell me, I can't, it's forbidden. He explained that an officer stood guard at the door every Sunday to make sure that he sold tobacco only, nothing else. I was alone now in the shop. I need it, I said. I absolutely need it. I was speaking in a whisper, agitated, ready to insist, plead. So he looked around, then quickly grabbed a notebook and handed it to me across the counter, saying, hide it under your coat. I kept the notebook under my coat all the way home. I was afraid it would slide out, fall on the ground while the porter was telling me something or other about the gas pipes. I left flushed when I turned the key to open the door to the apartment. I started to sneak off to my room, but I remembered that Michele was still in bed. Meanwhile, Mirella was calling me. Mama, Ricardo asked, did you buy the paper, Mama? I was agitated, confused. I was afraid I wouldn't manage to be alone while I took off my coat. I put it in the closet, I thought. No, Mirella's always going in there to get something of mine to wear, a pair of gloves, a blouse. The night table, Michele always opened it. The desk is now occupied by Ricardo. I considered that in the entire house, I no longer had a drawer or any storage space that was still mine. I proposed to assert my rights starting that day. In the linen closet, I decided. Then, I recalled that every Sunday, Mirella gets out a clean tablecloth when she's sitting at the table. I finally threw it in the rag bag in the kitchen. I had only just closed the bag when Mirella came in and said, "What's wrong, Mama? You're all red in the face." "It must be the coat," I said, "take it off. It's warm out today." It seems to me that she might say, "That's not true. It's because you're hiding something in the bag." In vain, I tried to convince myself that I had done nothing wrong. Again, I heard the tobacconist's voice warning me, "It's forbidden." I haven't had a moment's peace since I got this notebook, and always used to be a little sad when I always used to be a little sad when the children went out, but now I wish they'd go so I'd be left alone to write. I had never before considered the fact that, because of the small size of our house and my office schedule, I rarely have an opportunity to be alone. I've gone several days without writing because I felt detached from myself. I seem able to go on only if I forget myself. I'm increasingly convinced that this anxiety took possession of me starting the day I bought this notebook. An evil spirit, the devil seemed hidden on it. So I try to neglect it, living in the suitcase or the closet, but that's not enough. And in fact, the more tightly bound I am to my duties, the more limited my time, the more urgent the desire to write becomes. Something else keeps me confessing that I'm writing, it's the regret that I spend too much time on it. I often complain that I have too many things to do, that I'm the family servant, the household slave, that I never have a moment to read a book, for example. That's all true. But in a certain sense, that servitude has also become my strength, the halo of my martyrdom. I'm afraid that if I admitted I enjoyed even a short rest of some diversion, I would lose the reputation I have of dedicating every second of my time to the family. The stranger thing is that when I can finally take the notebook out of its hiding place, sit down, and begin to write, I find I have nothing to say except to report the daily struggle I endure to hide it. Lately, I've been hiding it in the old trunk where we store our winter clothes during the summer.
Thank you so much, Tina. So now to introduce a wonderful set of panelists with me, I'm joined by Jhumpa Lahiri, the Pulitzer Prize winning author and translator. Jhumpa's work often grapples with themes of displacement, nostalgia, and the search for belonging. She lives in Rome, and her latest book, a collection of short stories, Roman Stories, was published in 2023. And it deals with, amongst other things, the idea of foreignness within the Italian capital. Also here is Sheila Heti, a Canadian writer known for her varied and ambitious and playful explorations of contemporary life. She has been called by The New Yorker ruthlessly contemporary, and her latest book, The Alphabetical Diaries, questions both the form and potentials of a diary, so it's highly pertinent to this discussion. We're also joined by Claudia Durastanti, an Italian novelist, translator, music critic, and curator for the publishing imprint La Tartaruga. Her latest book, Strange as I Know, which I absolutely loved, blends autobiographical materials and fiction to trace a personal history, focusing particularly on Claudia's deaf parents and their family's migration between the US and Italy. But we're talking about Alba De Céspedes. And Jhumpa, I really want to start with you because I actually came across Alba's work through the collection of Italian short stories that you published with Penguin in 2019. And that was before this sort of current re-celebration of Alba De Céspedes, because it's important to note that, in her lifetime, she was famous, very acclaimed, widely read, a very popular figure, and then she really sort of fell out of the spotlight. And I'm interested just in how you came across her work, and if you could tell me a little bit about that discovery and why you included her short story, and sort of what you admired about her writing.
Certainly. Well, first of all, I would just like to say good afternoon to everybody, and to thank Miu Miu for organizing this incredible event and allowing us to celebrate and to remember Alba De Céspedes, who is really a writer who has, since I discovered her, been so meaningful to me. And I'm very honored to be sharing this space with you all. So how do I come to know Alba? So I moved to Rome in 2012 in a phase of, well, I suppose wanting to redefine myself in some ways as a person and also as a writer. And I was very hungry for new Italian writers. I had a handful that I knew. I had read, sort of Natalia Ginsburg and Elsa Morante and Pavese, Moravia. But after moving to Rome, I befriended many, a series of writers, and so they were always asking me, what are you reading? Whom are you reading? And I would say these 4 or 5 names, and they said, oh, but you must read so-and-so, you must read so-and-so. So through friends, through writers, my list began to grow of writers I should read, writers I should find in a bookshop. And one of these writers was Alba De Céspedes. A friend recommended her to me highly, and I had also sort of come across her name as I expanded my understanding of mostly of literary activity in Italy in the 20th century. But her books were nowhere to be found. So we're talking about 2012, 2013. And where I found her books were in used bookshops and in Porta Portese, which is the big market in Trastevere, where I live in Rome, including, I brought for show and tell, a copy of her very first novel, Nessuna torna indietro, which I found at Porta Portese. And I go, my husband and I tend to go every Sunday to the market, and I do find her novels there, which is very exciting. In any case, a few years after that, I was asked by Penguin Classics to put together this anthology of short stories, and because she was already on my radar, I looked for her short stories, and I found them, and I found one in particular called Invitation to, well, it was translated as Invitation to Dinner. It's called Invito a Pranzo in Italian, and I included it. And since then, as you say, there's been this incredible, reawakening of Alba, who, as you say, experienced incredible celebrity in her lifetime, but then her career ended, when she was not as central to the literary conversation, and then she literally fell out of print, which is, a very dangerous place for a writer and for one's legacy. But I mean, to speak more broadly about what interested me about her, I mean, two things really. I mean, one was I was fascinated by her biography, the fact that she was, half Cuban, half Italian, meaning she was always looking at Italy and living in Italy with a somewhat outsider's perspective. She was raised speaking various languages. She knew Spanish, she knew Italian, she went to a French school. She lived abroad. She obviously was, she knew English, so she had this linguistically rich profile. And she was, toward the end of her life, she wrote in French. So she becomes an example of what we would call an exophonic writer, which is what I myself was slowly moving toward in that phase. So these things about her, and I should also mention, of course, she's really a revolutionary writer and person. And everything she did, everything she wrote, everything she believed in, I found incredibly inspiring in terms of her position in the historic period she lived in Italy, and the many gestures she made publicly to resist fascism and to fight for freedom in general, but also the freedom of women. And then in terms of her themes, yeah, I mean, I think that, she writes books about, literary formation. Mm-hmm. And, I think I became a writer because I was reading books. I discovered books like Joyce, Portrait of an Artist, etc., like these sort of books that teach people how to become a writer, because I didn't know how to become a writer, and very few people know how to become a writer. It's a very mysterious thing. But she's doing this from the point of view of a woman, which adds a fundamental piece to the story, because it's, as we know, historically, it is much more challenging, challenging to virtually impossible, was virtually impossible for women to write and to call themselves writers and to become writers and to participate in a literary conversation. So I was fascinated by this aspect of her writing, which even from the very first book, we see that she's very interested in trying to understand the obstacles to women, women who have literary aspirations, who have the impulse to write. I was also very interested in her work with the diary form. I became, I can share an anecdote of one from my childhood. A bit like Alba De Céspedes, she describes the character of Valeria buying illegally a notebook. So when I was a very young girl, the only real act of theft of my life was I coveted the notebooks that my teachers had locked in their supply cupboards in school. And they would hand them out, for this is for spelling, this is for math, this is for this. But then I saw all of these other ones, and I wanted them so badly. And so when it was the school break, I would, and if the door was open, I would go in and I would take one for myself, and I would write my own things in that stolen notebook. So when I read Cuaderno Proibito, I just thought, oh my God, this is so powerful. But anyway, I was really interested in her use of the diary as a form. And I was also very struck by the way she knits together reflections on political reality and historical reality, and more interpersonal relationships and questions of family, marriage, motherhood. In this sense, her work has a beautiful hybrid quality as well. So there's a complexity to her work, which is quite remarkable, and I think we can't overstate it enough, because I think one of the issues with Alba De Céspedes is still, and was that she was sort of miscategorized as a not a rigorous, serious writer, that she was writing about women's things. I mean, you can even see from this cover of this book sort of what it's transmitting, the idea of what kind of book this might be. I mean, this is a harsh book that was censored by, it came out in 1938. It was censored because it's talking about, young girls having sex before marriage and other things that were absolutely contrary to, the expectations of fascist Italy. And so there's this disconnect between who she was and what she was writing about, and how she was writing, and the perception and the packaging and so in fact, she is a highly complex and as I say, revolutionary writer.
No, absolutely. And I think, as you put so beautifully there, this book, it does so many things. It gives an insight into the sort of political climate of the time, the position of women at the time, but it also, as you said, kind of questions the form of what a book can be and the form of how a diary can be used to construct a book. And talking about diaries, I really want to come to you here, Sheila, because your new book also questions the way that a diary can form the basis for a literary work. And just to give a bit of context, you can explain more. So the Alphabetical Diaries, for those who haven't read it, you should read it. It's very, very funny, I have to say. It's a sort of an experimental rethinking of the potentials of the diary form. So you took, correct me if I get any of this wrong, you took about 10 years worth of your diaries, which you'd written on your computer, and you put them into an Excel spreadsheet, and you ordered them by the first letter of each sentence, and then the book is that form. You edited bits out, but it moves from A to B to C. Firstly, why? But also, talk to me a little bit about your relationship with diaries. And I wonder, going back to what Jhumpa was saying, if you identify with Valeria in the Forbidden Notebook and this sense of sort of trying to find a space to write, trying to question sort of what you're writing for, what truths are emerging through the process of writing. And tell me why you set yourself this challenge of disrupting what a diary could be.
Sure. Yeah, so just to sort of explain, so every sentence in the book can only be in one place because it's perfectly alphabetized. So in Excel, there's a function that says A to Z. So it alphabetized every sentence. So it's not just the first letter, it's the second letter, third letter. So I was starting with this document of 500,000 words, 10 years of journals. And I write a journal sort of intermittently, just whenever I feel like it. I have a terrible memory. It's usually to remember a special event like today or to work out some kind of problem that I'm having. Sometimes you want to call a friend on the phone. It's the middle of the night. You can't. You've got to so it's just really a lot of circling, thinking, very neurotic, in other words. Unlike this, which this novel is very much about all the people around her. I think my diary is much more about how can I untangle something in my head. So the reason that I started this, I don't know, I had just published a book called How Should a Person Be, which was sort of a fictionalization of my life. And I think that was in 2010. And I think what I wanted to do was sort of to look back on the last number of years and see what my life had really been. Because when you fictionalize your life in the form of a novel, you start to take it for the truth. And I didn't want to go forward confused. I didn't want to go forward thinking that novel was what I had lived. So I wanted to look through my diaries, but I didn't want to read through them, first of all, because there was too many, and second of all, because it's sort of nauseating to read through one's diaries. And my mother's a doctor, my father's an engineer. I come from a very scientific family. And I had this thought that maybe I can approach who I had been for the last number of years scientifically. If I alphabetize it, then I can sort of get a sense of what kind of repetitions there were, what sort of themes are repeated. Who am I from a sort of, like an autopsy almost. And I wasn't thinking originally of it being a book that I would publish. But very, very quickly, I started to see that it was interesting to read oneself in that way. It's interesting to see, a bunch of sentences that are commands to oneself. Don't go on Facebook, don't do interviews, don't call that guy, don't da-da-da-da, and then all the don'ts that you have to yourself, and then all the perhapses and all the I hate, and you start to see yourself kind of from above. And I spent about 14 years editing the book because it was really unclear to me, what would be interesting for other people? Is it interesting to have 500,000 words of every single sentence and as a kind of display of this is what the self is? Or would it be more interesting to really pare it down, to make it narrative, more entertaining, more interesting? So I ended up cutting about 9/10 of the book. It's 50,000 words. Anyways, what I started to see and what I think is in common with Forbidden Notebook is that the self is really static, actually, and really fixed. And you have this fantasy about change. Oh, I'm always changing, I'm always growing, I'm learning new things. But when you put your diaries together in 10 years and alphabetize them, you see the opposite. You see this repetition of preoccupations. Maybe there's a different guy you're obsessed with, but there's always a guy. Or maybe you're wondering whether to move to a city and you think, well, my life has changed. I used to wonder about whether I should move to New York. Now I wonder about whether I should move to Los Angeles. But no, you're always wondering whether you should leave. So you really, really see like how you are the same over time, and different things come in to fill in these spots that you need. Okay, I need somebody to obsess with. I need a city to desire. I need a project to find impossible. I need a bossy friend. And I think what's interesting for me about this book is that although the character learns more about who she is by writing about herself, she doesn't really change. She can't really become other than herself. And I think that's what I found in the diary. Like, but there's something kind of satisfying about that. There's something satisfying about, okay, well, this is the person that I am, and that's the only task. It's not to become a different person. It's to sort of say, well, this is my task, is to be this person. And I think before I had done this project and edited it for 14 years, I thought completely otherwise about the self. And it's a paradox because you do feel inside yourself this boundlessness, like this boundless spirit. But it's like a boundless spirit inside very fixed constraints. Your body, your history, the people that you draw into your life, the thoughts that you repeatedly have. I don't know, it's very, and it's uncomfortable to look at yourself. And I think that's what this book is about too. Like, once you start to write, you can't lie. Once you start to, and once you start to write, and when you write about your life, it's kind of horrifying. I don't know if you guys feel like this, but the first time when I was young and I started to write, and you read back your own writing, it's like looking at your own eyes, like your eyes looking into your own eyes. Like, it's too much. It's kind of, it's too much. And I think, I don't know, I think the practice of becoming okay with it, okay with looking at yourself, almost like looking at yourself in the mirror, like, well, this is what it is. You know, there's something nice about.
Yeah, it's fascinating though what you're saying about sort of, the self and truth and construction of the self, and you know, you can't lie because it sort of diverges from what you're doing with diaries, Claudia, in Strangers I Know, because you see diaries as a tool for kind of invention and not as a way of sort of, creative fantasy, not as a way of kind of a faithful recording of life. And I want to talk to you about that. I also want to talk to you about a line within that book about diaries, which is like a memory from university where it's a professor in a class and he says, true suicide isn't dying, it's burning your own diaries. And I mean, that's something that applies to Valeria within this book. But tell me about this complex relationship you have between everything that Sheila was just speaking about in terms of truth, self, diary keeping, and do you ever destroy your notebooks? Tell me all about it.
Sure, no, I changed the devices. So, hi everyone, so nice to be here. And going back to what you said, I don't have that searing experiences with my diaries because I was lying too much, so from a very young age. So my first day in anthropology class, my professor says that the closest act to suicide is burning your own diaries. Traveling forward in time, when I first read The Forbidden Notebook, that was the first time, in a way, that I encountered in a novel something similar to I'm sure there's plenty of literary references where this happens, but there's a smell of burnt at the end of Forbidden Diary. It's literally the final sentence. Is that close to suicide? Would I frame it that way? No, because Valeria says that she aspires to a blank page, a new space. So to me, that's the farthest thing from a suicide. It also almost calls, it's sure it's given up out of social pressure, but perhaps we can also read it in this way, that the act of keeping a diary ran its course. She has accumulated experience. What is beautiful and stressful about reading this novel is the fact that the main character, writing a journal, is a disruptive experience. So she's trying to claim a new role in the accumulation of roles that a female had at that time. So mother, you don't even have your own name, you're a neighbor, you're a co-worker, And so she tries to become a person that writes a diary. Is this process or experiment a life endeavor? And I don't think so. At least that's not what applied to me. I was trying to go back to the first diaries I read as a young girl. One was mandatory and the other one was forbidden. So I read at the same time the diary of Anne Frank. So it's the diary of a witness, what was considered the biggest tragedy in Westernized culture and history. And then the diary of a fictional character, Laura Palmer from Twin Peaks. So that was a very confusing and interesting experience because I had something that was purely... Oh, I'm so sorry. I think it's Laura Palmer. And so what would become a trope and how we build female characters, unfortunately, that is the lost girl, the girl that all of a sudden disappears. And then you had a witness. And of course, I had enough sense within me not to try to compare my experience to Anne Frank and not even to Laura Palmer, but it was from the very beginning an interplay between being a witness to your life and fictionalizing it. So if I go back to my diaries when I was 8 and 10, I could see this interplay, which is very fascinating. So there is a sincerity to it, but I know nothing about the girl that went to school, what she liked, her favorite cartoons, her favorite comics. She's unretrievable to me and unknowable, but the voice that stays there is pretty intimate and relevant to the way I ended up using a diary as a tool. So going back to the device, when you were speaking about choosing a notebook that is also related to school years in a way, it's not the typical packaged diary. I wondered what happened to my own journals, and I think they changed the format. So I belong to a generation that had to live the switch to becoming a writer of public diaries through the internet and social media. What happened there? My analogic diaries, I was playing with different versions of myself. They were highly fictionalized, so I can see different roles, accumulation of roles. Suddenly, the public diary comes in, and I shrunk to myself. In a way, it completely changed this relationship between witnessing, sincerity, and performing yourself in public. So I think that was a phase I went through. And with La Tartaruga, we recently republished Carla Lonzi. And to me, it's so interesting that as a thinker, and a woman that really transformed, along with a collective, the experience of radical feminism. She moved from writing essays about historical art, the history of art, and she used a tape recorder. And then she moves along to establishing the experience of women reflecting about themselves, sharing their stories through this act of recording themselves. So what happens now, I think, with journals and diaries is that a lot of us, I'm trying to extend it, we have audio journaling and audio diaries. So as much as it's hated, this WhatsApp thing that we've been doing with vocal notes, I think it's one of the most infamous formats. But if I have to take account of my life in the past 5 years, how much did I leave there in this audio notes, especially with intimate female friends. And so I think a lot of the energy of representing myself goes there. What do I do with this data? Do I keep it? It's a ever-going archive. And I've noticed that taking notes about myself on my phone, I burn them into fiction. I use that. I use dialogue notes and I transform them in books, but then I delete the source. And I think because as I move along, I grow up, I am preoccupied by excesses of memory and excessive self-documenting acts. And so in a funny way, memoirs to me are the genre journals of youth, where you are more intensely dedicated in a weird way to preserving information, absorbing, collecting information about yourself. And maybe it's something that you slowly give up. So going back to Valeria, I'm always fascinated about giving up on a diary and maybe exploring different forms or different devices for telling yourself. And I will briefly say, I think Jhumpa and I had a conversation, I don't know if you remember, during the pandemic, what we were doing, what we were writing, and everybody expected that there would be a deluge of personal essays, memoirs, journals. We don't have a lot of COVID diaries. Maybe they would be boring, but if I have to think about myself and perception of reality at that time, my diaries are the translations I worked on. Because when you were speaking about repetitive patterns, there is sometimes a preoccupation with language. We use the same words over and over, and then we just discard them all of a sudden. So, and maybe that's too nerdy, but I can go back to my life and say, no, at that time in my writing and my perception of reality, I was really into certain adjectives, certain images, and they all end up in translations. So one day I'll probably look back at the translations I worked on, and I would say, oh, they're the closest form to a diary for me at that time.
It feels like what's emerging from this conversation is the idea of kind of multiple selves and how writing can both kind of facilitate those selves but also sort of inhibit those selves. And that is something that appears within the book that Valeria discusses herself, you know, the idea of a truest self. She says, now I wonder where I've been more sincere in these pages or in the actions I've performed, those which will leave an image of me like a beautiful portrait. But I want to go back to something that you raised, Jhumpa, about language and language's connection to a self, because you, in a similar way, as you said, to Alba De Céspedes, have written across different languages. You grew up across 2 languages, and now you write in Italian. Often your Italian is translated into English, sometimes by you, but sometimes by a different translator. And I'm fascinated by this idea of language as, like a diary, as a place to build a self and to build a narrative about oneself. I read the recent interview that you did with the Paris Review, and you said, it's only in Italian that I feel like I'm at the center of myself. And I just wonder if you can just tell me a little bit more about that. And I wonder if you agree with that equation between language and a diary, so sort of a portal to a narrative about the self.
Very much so. I mean, I can say that, that my activity as an exophonic writer, my moving into Italian as a writer is born in the pages of my diary. So it's only within the space of my diary where I feel still that nobody is listening and nobody is watching and no one is paying attention to me, that I felt free. I felt the freedom to begin writing and expressing myself in a new language. So all the writing that has come in Italian has its roots within my diary, which switched from the English language into Italian within a week after my family and I moved to Rome in 2012. And because in the diary, it's also a space where I'm not, it's pure freedom in the sense that there's no intention, I'm not thinking. I open the page, I pick up a pen, and just whatever is coming out from a deeper source. It's not passing through my brain even, though I realize my brain is involved in allowing me to write these sentences. But it doesn't feel that way. It's not thought out. And so in that sense, I owe to my diary my new identity, I suppose, as a writer in the Italian language. But I think we can back up and think more broadly in terms of, I think even if we go back to, say, ancient Greece and the example of Sappho, we know from scholarship, women are always speaking a different language. Within the construct of patriarchal Greece, ancient Greece, language is for men. Real language is for men. And women are speaking another kind of language. And we have examples of this throughout antiquity. And anybody who is looking at, how reading philosophy, reading ancient drama, looking at mythology, looking at all of the ways in which women's voices are hampered and hindered and censored and cut off and eliminated. We see the seeds of this reality, at least in the Western tradition, going back to ancient Greece. So in that sense, I think for Valeria, even though she is writing in Italian, she is developing her own, what we would say in Italian, linguaggio, right? Which is not exactly language, but it's her language. She is developing that inside of her diary. She is giving voice to herself as a woman, and the diary allows her, this is, I think, the most powerful thing about the novel, the diary allows her to think, to literally, to have thought, to have reflection, to be able to reflect upon things, to be able to analyze things, to be able to have distance on things, to be able to realize the underbelly of a certain superficial reality that she has been, that it has been her, lot in life to inherit and to manage, and so in that sense, I think every writer's diary of whatever gender is a place in which, because all writers, and Proust famously said, all books are written in a beautiful language, all beautiful books are written in a kind of foreign language. All beautiful books are written in a kind of foreign language. So what does that mean? I mean, Proust is French and writes in French, but what he's trying to say is that in order to write, and to write well, the writer must tap into his, her, their own language. And I think that the diary, for some of us, for Valeria, for me, I think even in English, I mean, my writing in English also grows out of my practice of keeping a diary from childhood through adolescence and to today. And now, I've had it, I'm almost 57 years old, so I've had 47 years of diaries, right? And there's an arc toward up until the age of 45 in English, and then it switches, and since then, my diaries have been in Italian. So, and so it's given rise to two different languages for me to understand who I am, to understand what I'm doing in this world, and so, and this has been fundamental, because I think that for many women, still, the message is listen but don't speak, take in but don't talk back, and at least in the diary you create a dialogue with yourself, and so at least you can talk back to yourself and exercise that right, because another basic thing that this novel is about rights. It's about the right. That's why the title in Italian, the word proibito, is so strong, because it is literally, it is something that is not allowed, it is not permitted, as we heard in the reading. She cannot buy a notebook on a Sunday. It is against the law. The stationer is going to make an exception for her and tell her to hide it under her coat and run quickly home. But I think that those of us who write, at least I feel this way. I always feel in some sense that I am breaking some kind of law, even though the law is not saying, I have been a very incredibly fortunate writer in that I was born in a time in history in which it was relatively, acceptable and understandable that a woman would have literary aspirations, which was certainly not the case for my great-grandmothers, okay? And I also have lived in societies in which I've been able to write what I feel compelled to write about without facing censorship. So these are two basic things for which I feel incredibly grateful. But I do feel as a woman that I've never lost sight of the fact that, all of this is relatively recent. The fact that we are women, that we are writing, that we are talking in front of a public, that we aren't sitting in the back room peeling vegetables and talking amongst ourselves, right? There are beautiful descriptions in this novel about when Valeria goes home to her childhood home, and she goes into her childhood room, and she sits on her childhood bed, and she talks to her mother, and they talk about, she says, we might have been talking about the price of artichokes, but we were really talking about much deeper, profound things that remain in a kind of fraleriga. This is between the lines. There's this kind of unspoken conversation that can happen between women. And that's what I'm talking about when I talk about, so women are always speaking another language. And I mean, this is in scholarship. I'm not inventing this observation or making this observation. But I think that's a very important aspect of all of this, because I think if we just go back and study even a little bit of literary history, we see how difficult to, as I said, impossible it once was for women to be heard just in general in the world, in society, and also within the space of literary culture.
And that's addressed in various ways within the book, one of which is, as you say, that her being forbidden from buying the notebook, and there is that suggestion of a sort of, that's to do with sort of competitor laws in terms of what Italian business could sell, but it sets up this idea of writing being forbidden. And she, makes these various efforts to hide her notebook in different places, and that sort of does add a layer of sort of a tragic comedy to the book. But what's strange is this idea of the diary being sort of so shocking that she has to hide it. But actually, she does kind of openly talk to her family at one point about keeping a diary, and she is mocked. The idea that she would have anything to say.
It's the most heartbreaking moment.
It's the most heartbreaking moment. Much more so for me than her struggling to hide it in places. It's that moment where she does kind of speak about it openly, this secret, and then it is just roundly dismissed as a sort of...
Well, they say, what would you possibly have to say? What could you possibly have to say, mama? And even her husband calls her mama, which is, a whole other topic we can discuss, but...
That really stung me, because I have a new-ish baby, and I've noticed that point where your boyfriend starts calling you mama in front, and it's a really collapses the self. So I really identified with that. But it's fascinating to me what you're saying about the way of writing as a way of sort of asking questions of oneself, because actually a book that I connected of yours to this a lot, actually maybe more so than the Alphabetical Diaries, was Motherhood, because a lot of that book is about this idea of asking yourself the question of whether you want to have children. And in the same way that Valeria is using her notebook to kind of put a spotlight on her own life and have the boldness to do that, in Motherhood you say, I've never asked myself this question, and I want to ask myself this question. A part of it is the sort of the lack of consideration and time that has been put on that. And did you make that link at all? Am I reaching there, or is it something you see?
I don't think you're reaching. Part of the obsession I think that Valeria has with her diary not being found by anybody in the family, which seems, I think, why is this such a problem? What would they care? But I think I think it's also about her. She doesn't want to see herself. She doesn't want to see her life as it really is. She's quite happy to sort of have this idea that she has a perfect life and a perfect family. And I think this fear that somebody's going to find the diary, somebody in the family is going to find it, she has to hide it, is partly her projection of not herself wanting to see the complications in her life. More so than anybody else, I think, because you sort of tell yourself lies in order to be in the situation that you're in as happily as possible. And you worry, once you start not lying to yourself about things, will everything fall apart? Will you have to escape? But to talk about motherhood, yes, that book was about trying to decide whether or not to have a child, among other things. I had not seen any representation in literature of a woman or a person grappling with that problem. I didn't even know that it was something to write about because of that. I thought that having that problem, I was in my early 30s when I started writing this book, having this question in my mind, having this problem, was below literature. It was not worthy of literature. And I didn't want to write about it. I felt embarrassed that this is what I was thinking about. I thought, why aren't you thinking about more important things? Now I think, what could be a more important thing to think about? But at the time, it felt kind of embarrassing and solipsistic and small. But then, you know, I had to sort of say to myself that you're not supposed to write a book about the things that you think you should write a book about. You have to write about a book, you got to write your book about the things you're thinking about anyway. And actually value the things that you're thinking about anyway, and explore them and go deeper into them, rather than try to imagine what would be worthy of literature or something. And the more that I started to write about this problem, the more I saw it as like not a problem of whether or not I have a child, but a problem of, well, what are my real values? What do I want to do in this life? What do I feel? How can I like separate what I've inherited, the ideas of what I think I should do, which everyone tells you, which all you get from everywhere, what you think your life should be for, and like what this little truth inside you actually wants to live. And how do you know what are your thoughts and feelings, and what are the thoughts and feelings that you've inherited from other people in the culture? And it was this kind of trying to separate those things in some way, which, you know, goes beyond the question of having a child or not. It applies to everything in one's life, you know. Yeah, and I think writing it and publishing it was also about wanting to live in a future where I'm 40, 50, 60, 70, and I tell myself, I thought about my life, you know? I didn't make that decision by not making it. And I wanted to think, well, whatever I decide, you know, if deciding is even the right word, because do we decide or are we pushed into things by destiny and fate or whatever, but whatever I decide, I want to have no regret. I want to say when I'm 60 or 70 years old, you did everything you could to take your life seriously. Where you are now was deliberate. And I did feel like I'm not supposed to think about this. I'm not supposed to think about my life in this way. I'm supposed to be sort of, other people are supposed to decide my life for me, you know, or biology or fate or my partner or whatever. And I don't know, it was just, so yeah, I mean, this book was very moving to me for that reason, because she's trying to think about her life. And it's like Jhumpa said, like, this is the one place where she can think. And once you start putting words to your experience rather than just feelings, you see the problems, you see the cracks. To have to identify things consciously, makes you see.
But then to counter that, and I am conscious of time, we do need to move to the Q&A, but Claudia, I want to ask you about this, because we're talking a lot about this idea of writing to liberate and how the diary liberates her, but it also like messes her up. You know, she is incredibly stressed as soon as she begins it.
Sorry, but liberation isn't pleasure. Like, yeah, I mean, liberation is stress. Like, having to make a choice, having to make choices. And it was strange, when I toured with Motherhood, I had women say to me, well, wasn't it so much easier in a time where you didn't have to decide? Well, yes, of course it was on one level easier, but I want the responsibility. I want the stress. I want the difficulty of making my own life, and the consequences, and the sorrow if I make the wrong decision. Like, I want that, rather than, you know, and so yes, her life becomes harder for her. She becomes unhappy, but that's truer, and that's hers, you know? And so I think it's not about being happy, knowing yourself.
No, totally, and there's a line that I really liked from the translator of the book, Anne Goldstein, and she quotes from the introduction to the Italian version of the novel, in which Nadia Terranova writes, "The genius of Alba De Céspedes is in shattering the illusion that writing is a place of refuge and replacing it with the certainty that it is a place that always both pollutes and sabotages us." And Claudia, just tell me, before we move to the Q&A, tell me quickly about that idea of writing to pollute and sabotage ourselves. Is that something that you identify with?
I would go, trying to pick up what's being said. First of all, I think it's useful, since we're having this conversation here in this city, that I read the books of Alba De Céspedes, Natalia Ginsburg, Anna Banti, Fabrizia Mondino is going to be retranslated by New Directions in English when I was living abroad. Because women who were writing in these formats and with that style and language were often perceived as not Italian and literary enough. So there's a sort of a prejudice in a way, the more you're translatable, the less you literary are. And so to me had deep consequences, not only on the reception of these authors, but also on the formats they were working on. And going back to that book and what's happening today with women writing and picking their genre and the formats they want to write in, I almost long for the idea of forbidden or something you can keep in an intimate space. Now, Deleuze used to speak about the necessity of having gaps of silence and solitude. And what often happens with marginalized groups, and women's writing was marginalized in Italy for a long time, and I will extend it also abroad, is the fact that all of a sudden you're hyperly visible, hyperly read, and it feels that it's a pressure and there's a leading force that is craving from your writing something really extractive, perhaps. So diaries, writing about the intimate life, the domestic, was not literary enough. Nowadays, it feels that it is almost the only way you could really work in the format to acquire or to gain a sort of being legitimate state in literature. So to me, I like to keep things more fluid and perhaps really pose myself questions about this kind of pressure of visibility that it's, we are on the other end of what Valeria is experiencing. She has the pressure to hide what she's doing. So she says, I don't have personal thoughts. My thoughts belong to the morals I had as a child and then to my husband. And she uses a beautiful sentence, and maybe I want to wrap it up here. She says, I am, which was relevant to that historical time, I am a bridge. So she's a bridge in between the necessity of wars of her mother and grandmother, the necessity of desire about her daughter who's going to live, also important years of social, cultural transformation in Italy. And she says, I can crumble. And I often wonder, before in Backstage we were talking about the fact that this book and Cesare Pavese's diaries come out in the same year. And so they were both authors in a way that we can see and understand as bridges. And there's something beautifully melancholic and tragic in the idea of, you can crumble now, but it has opened up many possibilities of writing or meditating as your condition in a society as a woman. I would like this to be more and more open and perhaps also reclaiming space where you're doing something that breaks the law or is forbidden.
I think that's a perfect note to surmise our discussion. I feel like we could keep going for hours. It's highly frustrating, but...
Can I just add something?
Yeah, of course.
I think that we can extrapolate from all of this, though, that, I think what is really being said in this novel is it's a case for literature. It's that literature comes out of books that we feel we should not write. Those are the books that need to be written and that are written and that make literature, that make great literature. And I think if the writer writes without a sense of fear, paranoia, extreme, sort of worry about what is going to happen, what will be the consequences of writing said book, they're not really writing, and they shouldn't be writing. We need to write out of the place of fear, anxiety, phobia, paranoia even, that Valeria suffers from a kind of a light paranoia. At one point she thinks that, this is kind of a surrealist moment in the book, she thinks all the furniture in her house is transparent. It's very appropriate for the week in Milano that we have the furniture. But she thinks that she sort of hallucinates that all of the furniture is transparent, and so everyone can see inside the trunk or under the table or under the, but I think this is what I think anybody, can take away from this novel. So it is about women's writing, women's voice, the right to speak, the right to write. It is all about those things. It is very much about those things, but it is also a case for, just literature in, more broadly, like for anyone who wants to write, that there has to be a sense of crossing the line and breaking the law to make great art.
And do you think that's also true of life? Like in order to make a true or great life, you have to cross those lines and break the law and scare yourself? Or do you think it's just literature?
No, I mean, I'm deep into a translation of Ovid's Metamorphoses, which is all about transformation, and transformation is always about crossing a boundary, right? You cross the boundary from being one thing to another thing. And there is a sense of, do not pass, do not go to the other side. I mean, our lives are ruled by, we have to carry documents and so to move from this place to that place. We know that in our world, in our modern world of, filled with nations and governments and et cetera. But I think that it is important to push back against preconceived notions of who we should be, what we should be, expectations, all of that. I think it's the key to transformation, and we know that transformation always involves a form of betrayal, a form of rupture, a form of breaking with one's former self, if not breaking the law. But there's a formal rupture that I think we can read metaphorically from this book, and just think more broadly about what it means to live and to make art.
Let's open up to questions from the audience. Does anyone have anything they would like to ask? Is anyone brave enough?
It's over there.
I cannot see what you're wearing to identify you, but...
Hi, Lou. Hi. Thank you so much for such an inspiring conversation. The question I had for the panel was about the timelessness. This book is as relevant now as it was when it was written, which is now around more than 70 years ago. What are your reflections on the timelessness of the novel? Thank you so much.
I don't know, I can answer from a bilingual perspective. I read the book in both languages, and not just for fun, out of playfulness, I went to check reception on Goodreads to see. Timelessness in the English translation, there's not so much attachment. It almost seems that the book is too English for its own good, in a way, for Italian readers, in the sense that the fact Italian reviews sometimes say, although la lingua è arcaica, the language may be archaic, the experience is very modern. I do not find the language of this book in this style to be archaic at all. And to me, it's almost, in Italy right now, we have a lot of writing about those years, if you consider which is the highest representation of historical time frames in Italian contemporary literature. You have the fascist years, or post-war years, and you have the years of lead in the 70s. So sometimes when you're trying to reconnect to that experience of those women, you often make the language more rigid and stiff because you think you have to conform to a certain expectation of how rigid and it was the experience of language at that time. But you had always a sort of multiple timelines within one time frame. At least that's how I see it. So to me, the timelessness and the modernity of this style, it's acknowledging at the same time this kind of nuances, and to me it helps to make it timeless, not only in the plot and the experience of this marginalized character in the household, but the way Alba De Céspedes is crafting the language and style of this book, to me, is really key and fundamental in understanding it as timeless, I would say. And so to me, it was funny to see in translation and the original language how the idea of what stays constant or what's period writing or, the expectations we have towards the past, that is interesting to me.
Yeah, and also I think her idea that she's a bridge. Yeah. We're all bridges. There is always the generation that just came and the one that's coming. So and this feeling of questioning your values by seeing the values that you inherited and the values that people are developing now. So there's always this feeling of, well, where do I change? Can I change? Do I situate myself with what's happening with people 20 years younger than me, or do I hold to the tradition? So I think every generation has that feeling of being this bridge where you're confused.
And also slightly being the stability of the bridge, but also being sort of lost in time, between, as you discussed so beautifully, between her daughter's values and life and norms and those of her mother and the communication styles.
Yeah.
Can I add, sorry, just one more thing. I don't know if there's writers in the room who are trying to go back, travel in time and write about characters at that stage. And so I think a very useful tool is diaries and reading diaries of rather than essays or history books. And to me, it's so fascinating when we think, and Alba De Céspedes, of course, was politically engaged. Her work is political. But at the same time, with Forbidden Notebook, there's an interesting way to deliver what would have felt the experience without tackling it straightforward. And so sometimes when we read about books of certain years, we think we are going to find open references to what's really going on. And I was really obsessed with letters of Cristina Campo to her friend Mita. And if you read them, they start from the early 50s to the 70s. And it feels nothing was really happening. There's no references later on to events that will lead to terrorism, wars briefly there, social tensions and stuff. But it's a profound and intense document of what was the experience at that time. So sometimes we have, compared to witnessing one's own time, this expectation that everything is relevant, everything is important. And I think Alba De Céspedes is an interesting case because it does convey and absorbs all the political energy of that time, but doing it slant.
I'm being reminded that we are low on time, but is there a final question? No, don't worry. Over there in the white shirt.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I usually don't throw around with citations, but in this room I feel like making a reference to Hélène Sixou, claiming that within the love of the Medusa, as a woman, opening your mouth in public, you feel your heart racing. I'm feeling that myself, but in a room like here, it's much easier, and I'm very grateful for that. One thing that I have been noticing for years now is that female literature is being read or interpreted very often autobiographically, and I'm curious about that. I want to know the reasons for that. I mean, diaries as an intimate genre of literature are, of course, something very specific, and they claim something very specific, but I don't think it's necessary to approach female literature always like that. And it seems to be like a key for every form of female literature. And I was wondering whether you could say something about that.
Well, I think we're just talking about inherent sexism throughout the centuries. I mean, from Dante to Proust to Hemingway, these are highly autobiographical writers. They're writing about their lives, they're writing in the first person, they're writing often in a very intimate mode, but they are unquestioned members of the literary canon from the very beginning. Okay, when a woman is writing in a personal vein, in the first person mode, autobiographically, in a diaristic mode, there's a there's a sense of this is a lesser activity because she's drawing on her personal experiences to have something to say. Whereas the man starts out having things to say, and whatever it is he has to say, it's important because he's a man. So this is a fact that we continue to push back against. Okay, and I will just add, I would just like to, if I could also add to the previous question about the relevance of Alba De Céspedes today. So I teach at Barnard College in New York, which is the sister school to Columbia. I was educated there myself. It remains an institution dedicated to educating young people who identify as women. And at Barnard last fall, I taught a course on the diary as a form and as a literary form and practice, and we ended the course with the Forbidden notebook of Alba De Céspedes. And so I can say to all of you how very relevant, how much she spoke to my students who were 19, 20 years old. They had no knowledge of, Italian literature, fascism, anything, post-war, none of this stuff. This book was written, 80 years ago, and it was so disturbing to them in all the good ways. So she is absolutely relevant and speaking to at least to the young women in my class. But I think that this remains. I mean, in spite of all of the road that has been, all the journey that has been made, there is still one can never let down one's guard. And I think, in a sense, now that I'm much older, I'm grateful for having gone to a women's school in the United States, because it instilled in me the fact that this can never be taken for granted. That it can never be taken for granted that a woman has the right to speak and to think and to speak either in private or in public, and to be, to never assume a position of subservient or from subservient to irrelevant compared to a man.
I think that's a rousing note to end on. Thank you so much, Claudia, Sheila, Jhumpa, and thank you to Miu Miu for facilitating such a engaging and inspiring discussion. And I'm sure you don't need to be told this again, but if you haven't read the book already, I would really urge you to read it and talk about it with your friends, and potentially also delve into the potentials of keeping a diary. So thank you so much.